Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back in time to a place that smells faintly of candle wax, old stone, and brewing yeast. You're in a chilly convent, somewhere in the middle of the Renaissance, where the air buzzes with Gregorian chants and the nuns wake long before the sun. The floors are cold, your robes are scratchy, and breakfast? Well, let's just say you're not here for the eggs. You've landed in one of Europe's most unlikely microbrewers, run entirely by women sworn to God, silence, and surprisingly robust brewing schedules. And yes, you probably won't survive this without a drink. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you read all tuning in from.
I'll dim the lights.
Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you is the chill. Convent walls don't exactly hold heat, and the floors under your feet are smooth stone, worn slightly concave from centuries of sandals. You wrap your habit tighter around your shoulders. It smells of starch, lavender, and just a trace of smoked barley. Somewhere nearby, a bell tolls the hour. Not that it matters. Time in here flows differently. It's measured in prayer cycles, daylight angles, and the slow, alchemical magic of fermentation. You shuffle down a long hallway lined with arches and flickering torches, every footstep softened by the silence. Then you enter the convent kitchen, not a kitchen like you know with granite countertops and a blender that never works, but a cavernous space dominated by iron pots, soot-streaked walls, and an earthy scent that tells you something's been stewing or brewing for hours. Sister Agnes, who looks like she hasn't smiled since the last crusade, is bent over a huge copper kettle, stirring a thick mash with a wooden paddle that's older than you. Her face is flushed, not from sin, but from steam. You glance over and spot a barrel in the corner marked Benedicta Triple. There's no doubt about it, too, wandered into a brewery masquerading as a convent. Brewing in convents wasn't some quaint side hobby. It was necessity. Water, especially in cities, was often as deadly as any sword. People needed something safe to drink, and beer low in alcohol, full of calories, and sterilized by boiling, was the holy grail of hydration. Especially for nuns, who were often left out of the better food supply chains, beer provided crucial sustenance. It was liquid bread. Bread, as we all know, is life. Historians still argue whether beer in convents began purely as a survival strategy or if it emerged alongside a more economic ambition. But you'll hear the soft clink of wooden mugs and see the wagons that come weekly, laden with sacks of barley and leaving full of casks. Something's brewing here beyond the spiritual. You pass the herb table, where bundles of dried lavender, yarrow, and something that suspiciously resembles mugwort hang in rows. These weren't just for the apothecary. They were common additives in pre-hop beer. Sister Clara, with ink-stained fingers and a skeptical squint, is copying out a brewing ratio into a dusty manuscript. If monks were the librarians of the medieval world, nuns were the chemists and, sometimes the pranksters. There is a curious account of one nun, Sister Matilda of Ghent, who allegedly laced her beer with extra valerian to keep visiting priests unusually sleepy during sermons. Is it true? Hard to say. But the parishioners definitely stopped asking for seconds. Still, life in a convent was hard. You rose before dawn, prayed for hours, worked until dusk, and tried not to collapse from overwork or starvation. Brewing gave these women something rare in their tightly controlled lives: autonomy. It required knowledge, skill, experimentation, and results. When your beer was bad, the sisters noticed. When it was good, they remembered. One manuscript, scribbled in a Latin-German mishmash, includes a margin note that reads, "Sister Beatrix's last batch caused 3 novices to see angels. Reduce the wormwood." You tuck that detail away and try not to chuckle. A warm gust of steam fogs the stained glass windows as the mash turns, slowly thickening into wort. You don't say anything. You read technically under a vow of silence, but you feel the rhythm of it. The quiet companionship of shared labor. This is work done in devotion, not just to God, but to each other. Sometimes the convent would set aside the strongest buyer for feast days. Imagine Easter morning, bells ringing, sisters gathering for Mass, and then toasting with dark, rich ale poured from hand-carved barrels. The most popular? Something called St. Hildegard's headache, which was less a drink and more a declaration of monastic merrymaking. And while the beer flowed freely inside the walls, outside, the townsfolk were taking note. Convent beer had a reputation, not just for being safer than the water, but for tasting better than anything the local taverns could muster. It wasn't long before these quiet women in plain robes became unofficial brewmasters for entire regions. But don't get too excited, this ice and tea and underdog tale where the nuns go commercial and open the first medieval beer chain. No, they brewed to survive, to nourish, to offer hospitality. Okay, maybe just a little to show up the monks next door. You settle into the rhythm now. The warmth of the brewing fire seeps into your bones. The scent of barley, sharp herbs, and singed wood clings to your sleeves. Somewhere above, a choir begins the evening chant. It floats down through the vents, weaving with the rising steam. You take a deep breath. This place, this moment, this convent brewery, it's not about breaking rules. It's about finding spaces to thrive inside them. You stay close to the warmth of the kitchen hearth as dawn stretches across the sky in faint gold-lit bands. The stone walls absorb the colors slowly, like old skin waking up after sleep. Somewhere, a rooster crows, which feels deeply unnecessary. You've already been up for hours. It's walking through the quiet rituals of the convent, with half-lidded eyes and a brain that still thinks it is dreaming. You follow the smell of yeast, a sour-sweet temps that fills your lungs and clings to your robe. It leads you deeper into the brewing rooms. A section of the convent you didn't even know existed until Sister Felicitas tugged your sleeve and motioned silently. No one speaks, of course. Silence is golden. And besides, the yeast seems to rise better when undisturbed by idle chatter. At least that's what Sister Gertrude insists, though you suspect it's just an excuse to avoid conversation. The brewing room is a sacred sort of mess. Clay jugs crowd the shelves, bundles of dried herbs dangle from ceiling beams, and copper kettles gleam in the low morning light. There's a rhythm here, an unspoken tempo. Mash, stir, rest, drain. You don't need to watch you, just follow the bubbling. What's surprising is just how skilled these women are. You assumed wrongly that cloistered life meant simplicity, but no. Brewing is science wrapped in mystery, and these women are precise. The mash temperature matters. The yeast must be alive, but not aggressive, and the timing of each step is practically choreographed. Sister Juliana, who can't be more than 20, gestures for you to feel the warmth of the fermenting barrel. You place your palm flat on the wood, and it's pulsing like a low, slow heartbeat. It's alive. Not metaphorically, literally. They keep a record of each batch, not in spreadsheets obviously, but in thick, alum-bound ledgers that smell of mildew and importance. Recipes, tweaks, weather notes. Did it rain during fermentation? Did Brother Emile sneeze too close to the cooling vat again? All logged, all tracked. Historians still argue whether this level of brewing detail came from necessity or curiosity. Were these nuns early scientists, or just desperate for decent hydration? Either way, they were experimenting centuries before the scientific method had a fancy name. And here's the quirky part. While monks often got all the brewing credit in historical records, convents were equally industrious and, often more innovative. One forgotten recipe lists boiled pumpkin and thyme as primary ingredients. Another includes crushed juniper berries and something translated only as garden sweetness. Which, let's be honest, could be literally anything from clover to old cabbage. You make your way to the adjacent room, where drying herbs curl in the rafters and sacks of grain lean against the walls. There's barley, oats, wheat ingredients, the nuns sourced from nearby farms. Sometimes even growing their own in tiny courtyard gardens. It's charming until you realize that tending crops, while also maintaining prayer hours and handwriting psalters, sounds like burnout with extra steps. There's a faint chant drifting through the wall morning lauds. You pause, listening. Not because you're especially devout, but because the layered voices wrap around the brewing steam like a lullaby. These women didn't separate their work from their worship. Brewing was devotion. They stirred prayers into their kettles, literally. Some traditions involved reciting psalms, while mashing grains or blessing each barrel before fermentation. Was it superstition? Sure. Was it charming? Also yes. Was it effective? Well, based on how many townsfolk showed up asking for a refill, it definitely didn't hurt. One record from a Bavarian convent details how beer brewed during the feast of Saint Scholastica always had a finer head and longer shelf life. Coincidence? Divine intervention? Or maybe just optimal humidity levels? The nuns never told. Of course, brewing wasn't just about creating good-tasting beer. It was about safety. Water was unpredictable filled with bacteria or waste. Boiling the water during beer production made it drinkable. The light beers, known as small beers, had minimal alcohol and were even given to children. Yes, you just pictured a toddler with a sippy cup full of nun beer. You're welcome. Back then, people didn't think of beer as alcohol the way we do. It was more like soup you could pour. And nuns, with their meticulous routines and natural immunity to marketing trends, were perfectly suited to master its production. Still, their recipes weren't always stable. Yeast was wild and unpredictable. It clung to spoons, hung in the air, lived in wooden buckets. Sometimes a batch went sour or exploded in storage. One convent legend speaks of a batch so volatile it burst 3 barrels and gave Sister Benedicta a fright that turned her hair white. She was 26, but failure didn't stop them. If anything, it drove the experiments further. You flip through one recipe book and find a page labeled "Only Not Again," with quantities scratched out and replaced multiple times. You start to feel the rhythm again. There's comfort in the method. The clatter of wooden spoons, the soft squish of grains underfoot, the hiss of steam rising like incense. Above it all, that unmistakable scent, yeast, and sanctity. You picture the sisters finishing their shift. They wipe their hands, stretch tired backs, and return to chapel for more prayer. Brewing in faith, kneeling in kettles. One hand on scripture, the other on the stir paddle. And you realize something odd. In a world that tried to make these women invisible, their beer made them unforgettable. The grain room is quieter now, its dusty warmth wrapping around you like a heavy quilt. You trail your fingers along burlap sacks stacked against the wall, barley, spelt rye all grown somewhere nearby, carried in by creaking wooden carts and the occasional stubborn mule. You pause at one particularly lumpy sack, labeled winter wheat. It's unclear whether the blessing makes it ferment better or just keeps the mice away. Either way, it's working.
Oh.
Today's brew starts with barley. You watch as Sister Adela scoops generous handfuls into a wide wooden trough. She moves methodically, like someone who's done this every 3rd day of her adult life, which she has. You join her, your sleeves rolled back and fingers sinking into the grain. It's warm, dry, a little bit alive. But here's the thing most people forget. Grain, glorious grain, wasn't easy to spare. Bread was the backbone of any medieval diet, especially in the Renaissance. Grain meant calories, and calories meant survival. Yet these nuns were pouring bucket after bucket into brewing vats. Why? Because in a world where dinner could be a turnip and half a prayer, beer was nutritional insurance. Liquid bread, remember? Was thick, rich, and packed with all the stuff your 16th century body craved. Carbs, B vitamins, and just enough alcohol to make everyone easier to get along with. Historians still argue whether convents were truly forced to brew out of caloric desperation, or if the practice simply endured. Because beer offered such consistent nourishment, what's clear is that in lean times, when meat was scarce and butter a dream, a mug of nuns' beer was a meal, and the nuns knew it. Brewing was planned like planting, seasonal, careful, and deeply tied to food stores. They had to consider how much grain they could spare from bread, how long it would take to ferment, how much would be needed to sustain everyone through Lent, and whether the younger novices had finally stopped sneaking sips from the fermenting barrels. You look around and see a few sisters scraping out mash from the previous brew thick. Heavy slop scooped into troughs for the pigs, nothing wasted. Even the spent grain had a second life. In fact, convents often became miniature food cycles. Grain became beer. Mash fed animals, animals gave meat and manure, and round it went. The kind of closed-loop system that would make any sustainability influencer weep gently into their compost bin. Then there's the baking. Yes, nuns brewed beer, but they also baked with it. Beer-battered breads, ale-soaked fruit cakes, and a chewy rye roll called Schwester crust, literally Sister S crust. That might break your teeth, but tasted amazing with fresh butter and ale. You duck under a wooden beam into a cooler storage room, where barrels sit stacked like sleepy cows. Some are labeled in elegant Latin. Others just have chalk scrawls, mild, strong, and don't touch. You assume S. Teresa has very specific feelings about who drinks what, and you wisely back away. That's when you notice the small calendar etched into the stone wall, tracking brewing days, feast days, and lean weeks.
Oh.
There's a quiet genius to it. Brewing was food logistics meets theology. You had to align beer production with fasting rules, saints' feasts, and unpredictable weather all while navigating the slow tick of ecclesiastical life. And you're starting to understand. These women weren't just surviving. They were thriving in their own stubborn way. Within their cloistered limits, they'd created a system of nourishment that worked and tasted great. There's even evidence whispers and letters and market records that some convents sold their surplus beer to townsfolk, discreetly of course, usually through the back gate and under the label of hospitality offerings. A pint for a pilgrim, a jug for a generous donor. It wasn't a business exactly, more of a holy side hustle. One such convent in Flanders brewed a strong dark ale known locally as Heilig Slumber, Holy Slumber. Locals swore a tankard would knock you out faster than a bishop's sermon. The nuns claimed it was for the infirm, but let's just say some very healthy folks found excuses to visit. A few convents even became brewing authorities. Recipes were guarded, barrels branded, and skilled sister brewers transferred between abbeys like rock stars on tour. Sister Heloise of Leuven was one such legend. Her dark stout had so much body, it was said to sit in the mug and pray with you. And here's where it gets weirdly modern. Some of these women kept improving the beer. They tweaked ratios, experimented with grain blends, even temperature-controlled their fermenting cellars using underground vents and clay pipes, which you might call early craft brewing innovation. One fringe theory claims a group of German nuns developed a rudimentary lagering technique by accident. When they left a batch to ferment in the snow, did it taste good? No one's sure. But apparently, it made for a very quiet Lent. There's something humbling about all this. You picture the world outside, plague, war, famine, and inside the convent. The quiet burble of fermentation, a fire-fed kettle, and a handful of women in wool robes solving the calories per day crisis with nothing but barley and prayer. By the time the next batch is cooling in its shallow copper pans, the convent kitchen smells like a bakery married a meadow. Toasted grain, wild yeast, and floral herbs mingle in the air. Sister Labila hums quietly as she sprinkles dried sage into a small test pot. You're pretty sure that's not regulation, but you're also not about to stop her. As the sun arcs overhead, you step back and take it all in. A system built from scratch, honed through repetition, driven by necessity, and somehow suffused with joy. And somewhere behind the solemn silence and sacred routine, there's a sparkle of pride. Because you can pray with your hands folded, or you can pray with a mash paddle. Either way, someone's going to sleep with a full belly tonight. By late afternoon, the brewing room takes on a different rhythm. The heat's sunk into the stone floor, the copper kettles are quiet, the air feels like steeped grain and sweet exhaustion. You're standing beside a row of drying pans where the Deus Wurten fermented beer cools slowly in broad, shallow vessels. You watch steam curl into the air like incense. Somewhere a sparrow chirps once, like even it knows this part is sacred. Cooling isn't just waiting around. It's the moment when wild yeast floats in on dust motes, hovering invisibly before finding its way into the liquid. It's like matchmaking for microbes. It's romantic, in a sort of microscopic fungal way. This step was risky. Too hot, and you'd kill the yeast. Too cool, and you risked contamination. But convents got good at this. They'd open certain windows and close others, create cross breezes, and fan the air with bundles of sage or lavender knot, just to flavor the beer, but to gently ward off unwanted guests, like flies, bacteria, or over-curious novices. And sometimes the yeast came from places even stranger. One story from a convent outside Zurich tells of a nun who always brewed the best batch until they realized she was unknowingly donating yeast from the sourdough starter. She kept tucked near her habit as hem for warmth. Yes, her skirt was the secret.
Passion meets fermentation.
Historians still argue whether wild yeast was better than cultivated strains, or if convents just didn't have other options. Most scholars agree that whatever the method, it worked. Somehow, like so many things in monastic life. You run your finger along the rim of a barrel as the sisters prepare it for the new brew. Beeswax seals the wood. Iron bands hold it steady. It's utilitarian and a little beautiful. The barrel is life.
Alvia.
You begin to understand why brewers gave theirs names like Faith and Mercy, and in one curious case, Stephen, no one knows why. Probably just a nun with a weird sense of humor. Barrels weren't just for storing beer, they were for aging, blending, and sometimes even hiding contraband spices during years when hops were taxed. That's right, even nuns knew how to finesse a tax code. Render unto Caesar, sure, but maybe not the lavender and coriander. Now, let's talk about hops. You finally reach the long wooden table covered in tiny burlap sachets. The smell hits you like a warm punch bitter, piney, herbal. Hops were the miracle ingredient no one saw coming. Originally used more for medicinal tinctures and pest control, someone, possibly a nun with nothing to lose, tossed some into a boiling vat. The bitterness balanced the sweetness of the malt, and it turned out hops had antibacterial properties. The beer lasted longer and tasted better. And that's when the game changed. Not everyone welcomed hops at first. Some traditionalists claimed they were unchristian because they altered the natural sweetness of beer. Others simply didn't like the flavor. The debate got theological. Some claimed the devil was in the bitterness, but the nuns, they leaned in. They tested, they measured, they even wrote flowery notes in the margins of recipe books. This hop makes one's tongue dance like angels. It reminds me of Brother Otto's sermons, long, but strangely pleasant. Here's your quirky tidbit for this leg of the journey. In some convents, hops were grown inside walled gardens with such reverence that they were nicknamed blessed vines. The sisters would sing as they harvested them, often just before dusk, under the belief that the cooler air locked in their oils, scientifically questionable, spiritually uplifting. It's a vibe. You glance over at Sister Beatrix, who is gently crushing a handful of hops in her palm, then holding it to her nose like she's sniffing a letter from an old friend. She smiles faintly and moves to the kettle. The boiling phase is loud, wet, and a little dangerous. The brew roils like a tiny cauldron, steam rising in thick clouds. The nuns add the hops slowly by the handful, according to their secret ratios. One turn of the spoon, a whispered prayer, and then more hops. It's not exact science, it's more like chemical intuition. In this room, Sister Magdalena is queen. She doesn't speak much, but when she stirs the boiling kettle, everyone watches. Her hands are steady, her eyes squint just slightly, calculating the color of the foam, the weight of the bubbles. You watch her throw in what looks like rosemary. Is that allowed? Is that even beer anymore? But no one questions her. Oh, you don't either. There's a rare calm in this chaos. The sisters move around the room like gears in an old clock. Each gesture has purpose. Every spill is caught with practiced grace. No one hurries. And yet nothing lingers. It's fluid. Forged by years of repetition, and maybe, just maybe, a bit of stubborn divine guidance. The heat from the kettles makes your forehead sweat, your robe clings. A drop of wort lands on your wrist, and it's sticky sweet, smelling faintly of warm bread and pine needles. You lick it without thinking. It's awful. Raw, bitter, yeasty. It'll take days, weeks maybe, before this brew becomes something drinkable. But you taste the potential. In the corner, Sister Agnes is writing something in a small ledger. You peek, weather notes, hop type, ferment in upper room, and then in small, careful Latin, watch this. One might be special. You smile. Every batch is a new gamble, a new chance at liquid glory. That's the truth of it. Brewing for these nuns wasn't just duty or tradition. It was hope. Each batch could be better. Each mug, a sermon. Each sip a blessing. And in a world that often forgot they existed, the beer gave them voice. You step back into the corridor as the sun begins to drop behind the cloister walls. The light is golden now, thick and soft, like the first pour from a well-settled bottle. Somewhere behind you, the wort continues to bubble. The wild yeast begins to wake. And soon, the barrels will be full again.
The convent quiets as twilight brushes across the stone floor, but your journey ain't done yet. You're ushered down a spiral stairway, narrow, cool, and echoing with the faint clink of wooden sandals. At the bottom, the fermentation cellar, the air shifts, It's damp, musky, and smells like history and half-ripened miracles. This is where the magic happens, or, depending on how cynical you're feeling, where sugar-loving microbes eat themselves silly and release alcohol to thank you. Either way, fermentation is where beer becomes beer. Sister Benedicta leads you in, holding a lantern low. Her face is all shadows and smirk. She knows you about to step into one of the most carefully guarded corners of the convent. Not because it's forbidden, but because it's finicky. These barrels are moody. Touch the wrong one, and it'll sulk for weeks. Fermentation is art, temperamental, smelly, gassy art. You trail a finger along the side of a large vat oak, wax-lined, warm to the touch. Inside, the day's wort now rests, and the yeast, some cultured, some wild, is already at work. Tiny bubbles collect near the surface. It's alive. You lean closer. There's a soft fizzing sound, like 1,000 tiny sighs. One mainstream historical fact that might surprise you. Many Renaissance nuns didn't just know about fermentation, they tracked it. Charts, calendars, and little wax tablets recorded changes in temperature, pressure, even moon phases. Some believed the waxing moon helped fermentation rise with the spirit. Others said that was nonsense. Historians still argue whether such beliefs had any measurable effect, or if they were just another way to cope with unpredictable results. You run your hand over a carved sigil on the nearest barrel, some kind of flower. A lily? Maybe. No. Wait, look closer. It's a hop cone, carved by a hand that knew its curves intimately. The nuns marked each vessel for identification and to ward off sabotage. Perhaps brewing, after all, wasn't immune to drama. There are records, real ones, of rival abbeys accusing each other of yeast theft. Yes, yeast theft. You're picturing a nun in the dead of night, sneaking through a cloister garden with a clay pot of starter dough like it's the crown jewels. Not far from the truth. In 1542, a Benedictine convent in Westphalia accused a nearby Franciscan priory of borrowing a strain that had won favor with visiting bishops. It was called Mary's Gold for its color and value, and its sudden disappearance sparked a decade of passive-aggressive psalm choices during joint masses. The sisters here keep their yeast in small clay crocks, sealed with beeswax and labeled with names like Old Friend, Quick Angel, and your favorite, Little Trouble. You peek into one. It's thick, pale, and bubbling faintly. You're pretty sure it winked at you. Fermentation could last days or weeks depending on the batch. Some were light and quick, ready in a few days. Others, darker and richer, were stored for months, evolving in flavor and strength. The nuns developed a sense for this. They'd taste a drop, listen to the bubbles, even sniff the corks like sommeliers in sandals. Sister Hiltrude, ancient and bent like a shepherd's crook, is the convent's nose. She waddles from barrel to barrel, lifting lids, closing her eyes, and inhaling deeply. Her pronouncements are brief. 2 days more, to warm, smells like that monk from Mainz. No one argues. But fermentation ain't always predictable. Sometimes barrels explode. Sometimes they don't bubble at all. Sometimes the yeast just gives up. You imagine the sisters gathering around a silent vat, whispering psalms and disappointment, then starting over. Because you always start over. That's the lesson of fermentation and monastic life. In one shadowy alcove, you spot a barrel half covered in cloth. There's a note pinned to it. Do not tap until Pentecost. You inch closer. It smells strong, like dark fruit and treacle and burnt wood. You're told it's a smoked porter meant for high feasts. The last batch gave someone visions, or indigestion. It's hard to say. As you sit on a cool stone bench near the back wall, a sister brings over a small wooden mug fermented wort, still sweet and thick, meant to be sipped slowly. You take a cautious taste. It's like cereal milk if cereal milk went to theology school. You smile. The nuns nod approvingly. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In some convents, the fermentation room doubled as a confessional. Not by design, but because it was private, quiet, and always warm. There's even a record of a novice mistaking a fermenting barrel for a kneeling post. She sat there confessing for an hour before realizing it wasn't responding. To be fair, the beer probably judged less harshly. As the night deepens, the barrels sigh and bubble in rhythm. You begin to hear them like a choir of old men clearing their throats. There's something soothing about it, consistent, predictable, even when it isn't, a kind of faith in fizz. The sisters begin to leave, one by one, bowing slightly toward the oldest barrel before they go. You ask why. Sister Benedicta leans in and whispers that one's seen more than the Mother Superior. She laughs softly and disappears into the darkness. You stay a little longer, alone now. The cellar hums with invisible life. Fermentation has begun. The yeast feast is underway. By morning, the brew will have changed. By next week, it might be brilliant, and you start to see why the nuns loved it, not just for nourishment or profit, but for the transformation. They took something raw and unfinished, locked it in a quiet room, and trusted that it would become more than it was. Maybe that's not just about beer.
You don't sleep in the convent? Not really. You rest with one eye open, listening to the creak of wooden rafters, the patter of nocturnal paws in the courtyard. Somewhere impossibly, the rhythmic bloop of fermenting beer echoing up from the cellar like it. Yes, counting down to some sacred unveiling. And when dawn finally stretches its pale fingers through the narrow windows, you're already dressed, already moving. Because today's the big one, tasting day. You follow the sisters through winding halls that smell faintly of wax and rosemary, out into the cold morning where your breath curls in the air like steam from a kettle. The tasting doesn't happen in the same rooms as brewing. It's too sacred for that. No, you're led to a quiet corner of the convent where the floors are smooth, the windows are small, and the barrels line the walls like sleeping giants. Tasting here is not a casual affair. There's a rhythm, a form. Think less frat party, more sacrament. Cups are wooden, passed hand to hand with reverent steadiness. Conversation is minimal, and always someone records the notes. You take your place at the long wooden table, hands folded. Sister Hilda, who you've learned is both the abbess and the head of quality assurance, begins by holding a candle behind the poured mug. She checks for clarity. Light through amber, the color of old coins and golden hay. This batch is success, or its failure rides on that glow. You take your first sip. It's cold, but not too cold. Slightly fizzy, faintly spicy, with a thick malt backbone that hits like toasted brown bread with cloves. You pause. Sip again. This is shockingly good. Here's some mainstream historical fact. Many Renaissance convents weren't just making passable beer. They were making the best beer, better than monks, better than secular brewers. Cities like Nuremberg and Ghent had entire markets that preferred the Nuns Brew, and some even passed laws to stop nuns from selling too competitively. One ordinance actually scolded a group of sisters for making a beverage that distracts the righteous from their tithes. You can't help but grin. Beer too good for God's ledger. Still, not every batch was a success, and this convent isn't immune. You watch as Sister Euphemia grimaces politely after sipping a newer brew. Tastes like holy water and onions, she mutters. A novice writes it down verbatim. Brutal honesty. Another monastic virtue. Sometimes the failures are mysterious. A strong batch might come out thin. A sweet one turns sour. One memorable disaster became so acidic the barrel hoops rusted. Historians still argue whether these inconsistencies were due to primitive sanitation, temperature variation, or perhaps celestial misalignment. Yes, that was a real theory. Brew failed? Blame Saturn. You're handed a different mug. This one darker, denser. You swirl it carefully. The head is creamy tan. You take a sip and blink. Raisins, smoke, licorice. It's weird. And delicious. Sister Marin beams proudly. That one we made during the eclipse. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. Had to do something. Here's a delightfully quirky tidbit. Some nuns gave batches names, not just numbers. They'd christen a good one Gratia or Cloister Gold, and an unlucky disaster might get labeled the Ninth Circle or more dramatically Judgment Foam. One convent in France famously had a blackboard where beer names were voted on by secret ballot. Democracy, but make it boozy. You move down the line, sipping tiny amounts of everything. Some beers are bright, citrusy, perfect for summer feast days. Others are dark as ink, meant for fasting seasons when solid food was forbidden. But thick beer? Technically allowed. The nuns leaned hard into that loophole. A mug of Doppelbock on an empty stomach. Let's just say Lent got weird. By mid-morning, the tasting room is buzzing not from alcohol, but from pride. The sisters exchange glances, small nods, knowing smiles. This isn't just quality control. This is validation. All that chopping, boiling, whispering to barrels it's paid off. The room slowly empties as mugs are rinsed and logs are updated. But you linger a moment longer, watching as Sister Hilda kneels in front of one of the newer barrels and presses her forehead lightly to the wood. A moment of thanks, not to the beer, to what it represents. Faith made fizzy. And just when you think this day couldn't get more surreal, you're taken to the archive. It's a room you didn't even know existed. Behind the chapel, through a door that squeaks like a guilty conscience, you descend into another chamber, lined floor to ceiling with scrolls, loose parchment, wax-sealed ledgers, and dusty leather-bound volumes. The brewing records. You run your fingers along the spine of a book dated 1473. It smells like hops and candle smoke and secrets. You open it carefully. Inside, recipes, weather logs, grain sources, detailed yeast behavior notes, and, in the margins, delightful chaos. Doodles of happy monks, a sketch of a cat wearing a cowl, a note reading, "Never brew with wet shoes. Bad luck." You laugh softly, but deeper in it gets technical. The sisters were experimenting long before modern science caught up. Acid titration using beet juice. Sugar readings, via dried fruit flotation. They used intuition, yes, but also trial, error, and a surprising grasp of chemistry. Some even speculated about the soul of the brew, not metaphorically. There's a page with a hand-drawn diagram of a barrel surrounded by concentric circles labeled spirit, form, essence, and fizz. You're not sure if it's brilliant or bonkers. Maybe both. The most curious page, though, is from an unnamed sister who wrote a full poem to her yeast, for stanzas, rhyming couplets. Starts off sweet, then gets strangely romantic. You close the book gently. She deserves her privacy. Outside, bells begin to ring for sext, the midday prayer. But before you leave, one last thing catches your eye. A ledger labeled guests. Inside are signatures, sketches, even comments. Some from bishops, one from a duchess who compared the beer to liquid absolution. Another simply says, "Best beer, north of sin." You add your own name. You draw a tiny hop. You write would return. 10 tenths. And mean it. You're full of beer, barley facts, and half-whispered yeast lore. But your day isn't done, not even close. After the tasting, the convent shifts gears. The sisters begin preparing for the market run, and you, lucky duck that you are, get to come along. Outside, the air smells like damp hay and anticipation. Wooden carts creak as barrels are loaded, each strapped tight with cloth, and rope marked with simple chalk, sigils, crosses, swirls. A few fish. You climb up next to Sister Theodora, the stout, no-nonsense brewer-in-chief. She gives you a nod like a ship captain accepting a new deckhand. You're in. You rumble down the hill toward the town, passing crumbling walls and bent trees that have clearly seen better centuries. In the distance, the bells of the city clang like someone's dropped an armful of brass pans off a balcony. Welcome to Renaissance commerce. Mainstream historical fact for the ride: nunneries were legally allowed to sell beer in many regions, especially during religious festivals, civic markets, or to raise funds for hospitals. In fact, several abbesses lobbied local guilds for brewing rights and won. It was rare economic power for women at the time, and they wielded it with surprising savvy. You reach the market square just as the stalls begin to open. Pickers dust their bread, fishmongers shout half-heartedly, and somewhere a pig is having a minor existential crisis. The sisters set up under a striped canopy with their barrels on display and a wooden placard reading simply, "Convent Ale. No marketing flair, no gimmicks, just confidence." Before long, locals begin to drift over. Some eye the beer skeptically, others with reverence. A man in a fur hat pays with exact coins and tips his cap. A washerwoman with cracked hands takes 2 mugs and docent tea bothers sipping before handing one off to her husband. He drinks and mutters, "Ah, the good one's back." You beam like you brewed it yourself. Sales pick up. Coins clink. Laughter floats. There's even light haggling. You watch as Sister Agnes, usually silent as stone, talks a merchant into buying a third barrel for your mother's wake. May she rest in God's malty peace. The man blinks, buys it, and wanders off looking slightly blessed and fully confused. Quirky tidbit time. Some convents developed secret hand signals for dealing with certain market customers. One meant bad taster, give him the mild batch. Another meant hasn't he paid full price since 1497. Sister Theodora uses what you think is the sign for. Don't he sell her the strong one. She talks too much. You discreetly mimic it. She glares at you. Worth it. As you help refill cups and smooth out coins, a boy with soot on his face walks by and pauses. Did nuns really make this? He asks, squinting up at you like you're wearing a wizard cloak. You nod, and they can drink it too? You shrugged. Depends on the abbess and the day. He whispers, my Da says nun beer never gives you headaches. You lean close and say that's because they whisper prayers into it while it ferments. He gasps and runs off. Sister Benedicta sighs. Now we'll have people asking for the prayer beer again. Historians still argue whether nun-brewed beer really was consistently better than that of their male counterparts. Some say the attention to detail, cleanliness, and recipe fidelity gave them an edge. Others argue it's a mix of good records and even better branding after all. Who questions a beer made by someone who wakes up at 4 a.m. to sing to God? The most popular brew at this market is a light herbal ale with a faint lavender scent, perfect for spring festivals. You overhear someone call it sunshine in a cup. Another drinker insists it helped her gout. A third whispers something about visions of St. Cecilia after her second mug. Sister Heltrude quietly marks needs dilution. After a few hours, the barrel stock is thinned. The coin purses have swelled, and the sun hovers directly overhead like a sleepy watchman. The sisters start packing up, careful not to rush. It's part ritual, part reputation. Leave too fast and people think you've run out. Stay too long and they think you're desperate. It's a tightrope, and these women walk it in sandals. You help lift an empty keg and feel your spine complain in several languages. Nearby, a friar tries to trade pickled eels for a half mug. Sister Moran stares him down until he withers like an unblessed raisin. Then, just as you're strapping the final barrel down, a city official approaches. Wide hat, wide belt, wider attitude. He's here to check documentation. You brace yourself for drama. But Sister Theodora pulls out a rolled parchment, seals intact, signatures glowing in that peculiar Renaissance ink that's somehow always brown and a little threatening. Squints, harems, nods, and leaves. You sigh with relief. Does that happen often? You ask. She snorts. Only when we outsell the monks? On the ride back, the cart feels lighter, the sisters looser. They hum little melodies, snacking on almonds and fresh bread. Someone passes you a half mug of leftover ale. It's warm, but still lovely. The road bumps gently beneath you. The sky stretches wide, and you find yourself lulled into something like joy. Because in this world of rules and robes and fermented miracles, you've seen something rare. Mastery, tradition, and a tiny sliver of rebellion served in a cup. As the convent gates reappear on the horizon, Sister Benedicta mutters, next week we test the honey batch. Pray it doesn't explode. You think she's joking? You hope she's joking? You unload in silence, save for the creaking of rope and the soft thud of barrels against stone. No grand celebration, no toast, just quiet satisfaction. Another market run completed, another little financial miracle performed, all with a smile and a frothy pour. You pause in the courtyard, mug in hand, and think. Beer built with prayer and persistence is a different kind of potion. One that nourishes without excess, delights without deception, and on lucky days sells out before noon. You're barely off the cart when you're swept back into the heartbeat of convent life, which astonishingly does not include naps after beer runs. Instead, it's laundry, candle making, and mending that await. But there's a silver lining, literally. You're finally allowed into the fermentation chamber. Now, fermentation doesn't sound glamorous. It sounds squishy. But as you descend the spiral steps into the bowels of the convent, the air shifts. Cooler, heavier, thicker, with that tangy perfume of yeast doing its sacred work. It's a little like walking into a cathedral. If the altar was sticky and smelled faintly of bananas and clove, then there they are, barrels, crocks, and squat stone vats, lined like an army of patient saints. Some are bubbling quietly. Others have lids propped open just slightly, releasing the kind of earthy, funky aromas that make you think of forest roots and wild bread. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 1400s, fermentation in convents had already shifted from spontaneous wild brews to more controlled methods. Nuns often reused the sediment, the lees from successful batches, creating early forms of what we'd now call yeast starters. It wasn't modern science yet, but it was repeatable, and that changed everything. Sister Magdala hands you a wooden paddle. Stir clockwise, she says, always clockwise. Counter makes it sulky. You laugh.
She doesn't.
You stir clockwise. As you move around the room, you begin to notice subtle differences between batches. This one smells sweet and slightly floral, likely honeyed. That one's sour, sharp, almost medicinal, probably herbs. A few are sealed tight with beeswax. High pressure, Sister Ursina explains, tapping one affectionately. We call him Brother Boom. And here's your delightfully quirky tidbit. Some nunneries gave their fermentation crocks names. Not just for tracking real names like Teresia the Patient or Grumbly Gertrude. One Belgian convent reportedly kept a log of crock moods. Gertrude is hissing again. Teresia appears calm. Avoid Brother Peter until the full moon passes. You smile at one labeled simply Mildred. She does seem calm. You take a moment to lean closer to a fermenting vat. The surface shivers with life. Tiny bubbles cling to the sides. If you listen closely, really closely, it's not just noise. It's conversation. You swear the beer is whispering. Still, fermentation is fragile. Too hot and you get sour sludge. Too cold and the yeast sleeps. One convent recorded an entire year's loss after a freak frost. Another built underground chambers with torches and damp cloths to maintain perfect temperature. Historians still argue whether these cooling methods were pure intuition, trial and error, or some secret lore handed down from beer brewing angels. You'd believe any of those at this point. You pause in front of a tall ceramic vat marked with a single spiral. Sister Magdala says it's one of the older ones used for off-calendar experiments. You peer inside. It's darker, richer in scent. There's a faint smell of overripe plum and black pepper. That's the resurrection batch, she says casually. Fermented 3 times. You blink. Why? She shrugs. To see what happens? Later, you're shown the yeast archive. Yes, yeast archive. It's a closet-sized room with rows of sealed jars, each filled with dried, crusted remnants of past fermentation. Beside them, scrolls, notes, rituals. You pick one up and read. Batch 22. Used Brother Joseph S. candle scrap for flavor. Accidentally holy, you love it here. It turns out the nuns learned to bank yeast long before Louis Pasteur made it fashionable. They dry the sediment on cloth, scrape it off, and store it with spices or chalk dust to keep it stable. Some even kept little wooden amulets tied around their best samples protection charms, or maybe just superstition. Maybe both. You're handed a small spoon of dried lees and told to taste it. You hesitate. It looks like old wallpaper, but you pop it in. It's sharp, salty, oddly fruity, and it zaps your tongue like it knows things. That's last year's Easter brew, Sister Hiltrude says. Still spicy. You nod, eyes watering slightly. The nuns don't just treat fermentation as chemistry, they treat it as personality. They talk to the yeast. They soothe it with song. One elderly sister swears that reading psalms near the vats keeps infections away. No one questions her. Her beer has never failed. As the day wanes, you help transfer a finished brew from vat to cask. This part requires precision. You use siphons made of reed and leather. You tilt, you breathe, you concentrate. There's no room for spills unless you want to be on mop duty until Pentecost. This moment oddly feels like a sacrament. It's the fluid moving from one vessel to another, the shared attention, the quiet respect. It's easy to forget that beer here isn't just a drink. It's a living thread that weaves through devotion, labor, history, and community. One misstep, and the whole thing unravels. One success, and you've bottled something bigger than flavor. A few sisters mark the barrels with chalk runes, blends of letters, symbols, and weather icons. One even draws a tiny snail. Slow fermentation, she says. You respect the snail. You read not aloud in the sanctum, the deep cellars, where the long-aging ales rest for months, but you shown a map of them. It looks more like a treasure map than a floor plan. Some barrels down there have been untouched for decades. One, you're told, is sealed in wax and prayers, meant to be opened only when the bells ring for a pope born under a comet. You decide not to ask. Historians still debate whether convent ales played a measurable role in local economies or were simply oddities. Some see them as minor curiosities. Others argue they were the backbone of religious microeconomies, especially in famine years. The truth is probably somewhere in between, like most things brewed slowly and with intention. Before you leave the fermentation chamber, you're handed a tiny clay medallion. On it is etched a symbol you saw earlier on a Barola crescent inside a wheat stalk. That's our mark, says Sister Magdala. You earned it, but don't wear it in town. The monks get jealous. You hold the medallion tight in your hand as you rise back into the evening light. The scent of yeast still clinging to your skin, the hum of fermentation still in your ears. You're learning more than history here. You're learning to see the invisible labor behind the visible delight. And it all starts in the dark, damp silence, where the beer dreams itself into being. You're finally starting to think you've got this nun brewing life figured out. Yeast whispers, barrel sigils, market charm easy, right? But then the bell rings for vespers, and the brewery becomes a chapel once more. You're gently nudged out of the fermentation chamber by Sister Magdala, who says, "Go sit." You need balance. You don't argue, not because you're obedient, but because your legs are jelly and you still taste that mysterious plum pepper experiment on your tongue. Evening prayers float like incense. Chants echo through the stone halls, and for a moment you wonder if the beer can hear it too. Maybe that's why it tastes so divine. Maybe it's been singing back this whole time. After prayers, you re-guided through an unmarked door to a space you didn't know existed. The recipe archive. Now, calling it a room is generous. It's more of a glorified closet with sagging wooden shelves and that distinct smell of dust, ink, and someone's long-forgotten fruitcake. Parchments are stacked haphazardly, tied with twine or squashed between dried herbs. The air has that dry crackle of serious secrets. Sister Benedicta warns you. Handle nothing unless it speaks to you. You're not entirely sure she's joking. Mainstream historical fact, just to ground us for a second, convents often kept detailed brewing records. These included ingredients, seasonal variations, weather notes, and, sometimes, the emotional state of the brewer. No, really. You find a margin note that reads, "Aunt passed. Ale, unusually bitter." You whisper a soft wow to yourself. You're handed a vellum sheet dated 1478. The ink has bled a little, and there's a waxy stain shaped like a chicken foot. The title reads, "Tonic for the Midwinter Thirst." It lists ingredients like angelica root, mugwort, rosemary, something smudged that looks suspiciously like duck shadow. Sister Hiltrude peers over your shoulder and mutters, "Could be dark sugar, or not." Recipe collections like this weren't just practical, they were legacy. Some lines are written in Latin, others in regional dialects, some in what might just be ... gossip. Rebecca's batch did sour. She blamed the moon. You begin to sense that every brew had a story, and every story had an opinion. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In one 16th century convent, they maintained 2 sets of recipe scrolls. One for honest brews, and another tucked in a hollow statue, foot for festal formulas. The difference? The second ones included spirited additives. Think figs soaked in brandy, nutmeg in quantities that border on magical mischief. They were reserved for feast days, and according to one entry, for calming troubled monks. You chuckle. Sister Marin raises an eyebrow but says nothing. As you explore the shelves, you notice small symbols beside many recipes. Suns for summer, moons for winter, a tiny frog for unpredictable result, and a spiral for divine accident. One scroll has 4 spirals. You decide not to touch it.
Why so many herbs?
You ask aloud. Sister Ursina answers without looking up from her sorting. Because beer is medicine, especially when medicine is terrible. She's right, of course. A time when water could betray you, and leeches were the go-to curl, ale mild. Fortified with herbs was the safer bet. Calendula for digestion. Sage for nerves. Juniper to clear the lungs. Historians still argue whether nuns were truly proto-pharmacists or simply good at trial-and-error healing. Either way, your stomach's been better since arrival. You'd carefully pick up a bundle of notes bound with red ribbon. The first sheet reads, Ale for quiet reflection. Ingredients, wheat, malt, honey, lavender, chamomile. Instructions, brew under a waning moon. Serve at dusk. Do not speak until the second sip. You suddenly feel very, very calm. There's a pattern, you notice, in how the recipes shift over time. Early ones are chaotic lists scratched into the margins of prayers or pressed between psalms. Later entries get more structured, even poetic. One reads like a riddle. 2 roots from shaded earth. 3 leaves kissed by rain. Boil till the sky bleeds amber. Then stir as saints do. You wonder if that one's metaphorical or just pretentious. Sister Benedicta winks at you. That batch made everyone polite for 3 days. You immediately copy it down. Many recipes mention saints, not just as dedications, but as timing devices. Brew this on Cecilia's feast day. Wait 3 hours past matins on the Tuesday after Hildegard's commemoration. Brew again, only if the owls cry twice. That last one feels personal. And then just as you re-elbow deep in ale for stomach wind and moral regret, you find it. The Scarlet Book, bound in faded red leather, it hums with mystery. Not literally, but you swear the air thickens as you flip it open. The script is finer, the ink darker. These recipes are odd. One calls for a drop of consecrated wine. Another insists on boiling only with silent water. The third simply reads, Use caution. Tasted thunder once. You look up. Is this the experimental book, you ask? No, says Sister Magdala. That's the practical one. You laugh she doesn't. Before you leave the archive, you're offered a task. Create your own recipe, you blink. I don't know enough. But Sister Hiltrude presses a blank parchment into your hand. You've tasted, you've stirred, you've listened. It's more than most, so you sit and write. Maybe something simple. Barley and honey. A twist of time, brewed under candlelight. Served with music. And a note. Best enjoyed with friends who don't ask too many questions. You slip your parchment into a small wooden box labeled New Hopes. It lands softly atop others, each handwritten in hesitant, hopeful ink. And as the archive door clicks shut behind you, you realize you've just become a piece of the story. A single grain in the vast, strange loaf of time. It's early the next morning when you re-roused by the not-so-gentle banging of a spoon on an iron pan. Sister Maren enters your room with a simple announcement. Bottling day. You stretch, bones creaking like old pews, and shuffle your way to the bottling room. There's a low buzz of energy, the kind that happens when a long process is finally nearing its glorious end. Barrels are being wheeled in from storage with reverent care. You half expect someone to sprinkle holy water on them. Wouldn't be the weirdest thing you've seen this week. The room smells heavenly ripe grain, toasted wood, and a faint sweetness that promises something worth waiting for. The sisters have their sleeves rolled up. One's whistling a hymn, another is sharpening a quill to label corks. You take your spot at the rinsing station and begin scrubbing bottles like they re-medieval glass slippers, your mainstream historical fact of the day. Bottling wasn't common until the 16th century, when glass production improved enough to make it feasible. Before that, most brews were stored in barrels and casks, served from tap or ladle. But nuns, ever the resourceful bunch, began repurposing old apothecary jars and olive oil flasks to store smaller batches, especially the stronger or more medicinal ales meant for personal healing or quiet sips in cloisters. You're handed one such bottle-thick smoky glass with a dimpled bottom. This one's for the monks, Sister Agnetha smirks. We make theirs extra herby, keeps them in line. You laugh, then choke slightly when she adds, and slightly laxative. Bottling is part precision, part choreography. You rinse, another sister fills, another wipes and corks, another dips the top in beeswax, sealing it with a twist and a quick prayer. The wax colors are symbolic. Gold for festal ales, green for healing brews, red for frankly just delicious. There's even a pale blue for experiments. You spot one labeled Do Not Drink Before Compline. You raise an eyebrow. Sister Ursina, shrugs, it sings. Here, your quirky fact. One convent in Bavaria added crushed sapphires to their bottling wax for their celestial brew, claiming it calmed the humors and made you dream in color. Did it work? Hard to say. But one nun reportedly woke up speaking fluent Greek, temporarily. Today. You're bottling the lavender quiet elf, the one you remember from the recipe archive. It's light, floral, with just a whisper of honey and that soft, meadow-like smell that makes you want to nap in a sunbeam. The sisters say it est, the calm before the storm, batch served 2 guests, before big events like feast days or bishop visits. As you fill the bottles, you start to notice the little gestures of care. How the sisters wipe each neck clean with a cloth embroidered with the convent's symbola, barley stalk, and crescent. How they hum the same 4-note melody with every sealing. How the labels, while simple, carry handwritten notations, gentle finish. Tastes like spring rain. Don't give to Sister Imelda. Remember 1489. Historians still argue whether these early bottling practices were intended as genuine attempts at preservation or more ceremonial in nature. After all, ale didn't store well without refrigeration. But the evidence suggests these convents were onto something. Cool cellars, heavy glass, and clever herbs meant some ales could last weeks, even months. In rare cases, years, you're tasked with labeling a small batch meant for pilgrims. The sister supervising leans in and says, "Write something comforting. They've walked a long way." You think for a second, then you write 4 sore feet and sore hearts. Sip slowly. The sister nods in approval. Just before midday, a small group of travelers arrives at the convent gate. Pilgrims, dusty, sunburned, wide-eyed. Some carry tokens of their journey shells, wooden staffs, smudged parchments with scribbled blessings. A few are limping, all are thirsty. They're welcomed with quiet grace, ushered to the shaded portico. Bowls of water are passed around, first for hands, then for faces. Then comes the quiet ale. Just a small cup each. The reaction is nearly universal. Eyebrows lift, shoulders drop. One man, bandaged foot propped on a stool, lets out an involuntary awe, like the soul leaving his body. The sisters smile quietly. You beam. One woman takes your hand. Did you make this? You hesitate? Then nod, sort of. Bless you, she says. It tastes like home. You turn away so she doesn't see your eyes go shiny. By mid-afternoon, the bottling slows. Sister Magdala begins sorting the finished goods into baskets. Some for guests, some for trade, a few tucked aside for special internal use. One bottle is placed in a tiny velvet-lined box. You ask what it's for? That, she says, is our annual offering to the bishop. She winks, keeps him from nosing around too much. Of course, not all bottles are perfect. One cracks during corking. Another hisses like an angry cat and starts fizzing foam from the mouth. Sister Hiltrude calmly places it in a wooden pail and says, "That one's going to the compost gods." You ask if anything ever explodes? She nods solemnly. Last year's winter stout took out a candle holder and half the psalms. Still, most bottles behave. By evening, the storage shelf is gleaming with neat rows of finished product. Each one a little artifact of intention, community, and mystery. As you wipe down your hands and look over the day's work, you realize this part, the bottling, the labeling, the sharing, it's not just an end, it's the true beginning. Everything that's happened before was preparation for this moment. Now the beer leaves the convent, it travels, it meets strangers, it enters stories you'll never hear, and something about that feels deeply holy. Sister Ursina slaps a cork into the last bottle and says, "And now we nap." You think she's kidding? She's not. You wake up to soft bells tolling, not the sharp clang of morning duties, but a gentle, late forenoon chime that makes you wonder what time it even is. Nap, you were told, and a nap it was. You swear you only blinked. But somehow it is 3 hours later, and there is a faint scent of baked apples drifting in through the open window. When you shuffle outside and your slippers still groggy, hair completely betraying you find the courtyard bathed in golden light. The nuns are gathered for what they call the evening rest, which, hilariously, involves bread, ale, and the swapping of convent gossip with the softest of smiles. You are handed a cup before you can speak. Taste this, Sister Magdala urges, and try not to float away. You sip. It's different, deeper, darker, richer. There's a tangle of roasted grain and dried fruit on your tongue, like the flavor equivalent of a secret. Everyone's sipping the same brew, and from the hushed satisfaction in the air, it's clearly something special. Consolation ale, someone says. We only pour it when something ends. Wait, what ended? You ask, half alarmed. Bottling week, says Sister Hiltrude. You made it through. You survived. You nod solemnly. I almost didn't. Mainstream historical fact. Many convents had traditions surrounding the end of brewing seasons. They weren't always grand ceremonies. There were often small rituals, prayers of thanks, special meals, or communal tastings of first drafts. It wasn't just about the beer. It was about the rhythm of time, the changing of roles, the return to balance. Your cup is refilled. Here's your fringe fact. Fresh from the rumor shelf, one particular Benedictine convent in 1503 hosted a yeast farewell feast at the end of each brewing cycle. Everyone wore yellow. Songs were sung in honor of St. Brigid, their patroness of brewing. And get this, the starter yeast was given a tiny blessing before being retired or refreshed. Some records even suggest a jar of particularly mischievous yeast was buried in the garden with a flower on top. No one's quite sure why. Back in your convent, the sisters pass around slices of apple and fennel bread. The herbs complement the ale, teasing out hints of licorice and smoke you didn't taste before. Sister Benedicta asks if you've considered staying. You nearly choke on your bread. She adds, not forever, just ... longer. To help us prepare the next batch, autumn brews need a different hand. There's a murmur of agreement. Sister Ursina says, we could show you how to build a cool ship, Sister Marin offers, or teach you the night brew techniques. You start to protest, something about responsibilities or deadlines or a dentist appointment. But then someone mentions the cardamom fig porter recipe and you forget what year it is. The conversation meanders and the topic turns to brew dreams. Not the poetic, kind, literal dreams had after drinking ale. Apparently, several sisters have kept informal journals, tracking visions and insights that follow a particularly strong batch. Sister Magdala flips through a little red notebook. Last spring's batch gave me a dream of climbing a tree made of bread. There were birds offering me spices. I woke up crying. Sister Agnetha shrugs. 3 nights ago, I dreamed I was a bottle. You quietly resolved to start keeping a notebook, too. Historians still debate whether such dream reports were taken seriously or simply served as a form of entertainment in the often monotonous cycle of cloistered life. But it's clear even now that these women view beer not just as beverage, but as something gently mystical. A mirror, a question, moment suspended in amber. As the sun lowers, someone brings out the archivist's flask, an aged, fortified ale said to contain drops from every major batch of the last decade. It's thick, dark, and carries flavors no tongue can fully name. Everyone gets a spoonful. 1 spoon. That's it, you're warned ahead of time. You sip it and instantly feel like you've time-traveled into a velvet curtain. There's molasses. Sure. Oak. Raisin. But also... dusty hymnals. Burnt plum, your grandmother's sweater? It's as if memory itself was poured into a bottle and served at the perfect temperature. You close your eyes. For a moment you hear nothing but bees humming. Then the soft laughter of the sisters. Someone breaks into song, a nonsense melody that doesn't belong to any language, but you understand it perfectly. The evening rest fades into twilight. Lanterns are lit. The courtyard fills with soft light and softer voices. You help gather empty cups, brush crumbs off benches, and fold linen napkins embroidered with tiny vines and hops. You're told tomorrow is cleaning day, then garden tending, then a quiet fast, then a feast. Yes. Is there always a rhythm like this? Yes, they say. It is, but it's never the same dance twice. You return to your room. On your pillow, a small folded note. You brewed with kindness. Come back anytime. It's signed with a barley stalk. You lay back. The evening ale is still warm in your belly. Your muscles hum with fatigue, but not in a bad way. You feel ... balanced, like a pendulum that's found its resting point. And just before sleep pulls you under, you wonder if you'll dream of birds offering you spices too. Your dream is a bit of a blur. Something about walking barefoot through a field of barley. each stalk whispering a different recipe. You think you spoke to a hop cone with a monocle. It might have given you life advice. You wake up smiling. It's still dark outside, just the first threads of light touching the rim of the world. But the convent is already alive in that hush before dawn sort of way. No bells, just the muffled pad of sandals, the occasional creak of wood, and the faint sound of something boiling. You follow it like a sleepy moth to the kitchen. Their sister Marin is already preparing for today's project, yeast cultivation. If brewing is bread, she says yeast is the soul that rises. You're handed a clay jar and a spoon and told to sit. We're harvesting from yesterday's coolship. Sister Asina explains. See what the air gave us. Mainstream fact. Wild yeast cultivation was one of the true mysteries of early brewing. Renaissance brewers didn't know about microbiology, but they understood pattern, intuition, and patience. They noticed that brews left uncovered near orchards or flower beds fermented better. They couldn't name Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but they honored it like a spirit. You lift the cloth from the shallow cooling pan. Thin, foamy film has started to gather at the surface, a pale, shimmering skin that smells faintly fruity, slightly metallic, and somehow alive. It's the yeast. Wild, air-caught, invisible until now. Your job, skim it, feed it, and decide whether it's good enough for the next batch. You feel like a medieval microbiologist in robes. You're looking for active bubbles, Sister Heltrude says, peering over your shoulder. Little whispers of life, like it's trying to speak. You skim carefully, spooning it into a jar with fresh wort, what the sisters call yeast porridge. You swirl it gently and place it near the window. Now we watch, someone says, and wait. Your fringe tidbit. In one small convent in what's now eastern France, Sister reportedly trained her yeast strains with Gregorian chant. She kept 3 separate jars, exposed to a different mode. She claimed the Lydian one made beers bright and hopeful, while the Dorian jar produced more somber stouts. Skeptical? Sure. But honestly, you're not ruling anything out anymore. While your sample ferments, you tour the yeast cellar.
Dan?
Yes, an actual room just for yeast starters. Rows of clay pots labeled with strange nicknames. Dancing Mouse. Father Bernard's Revenge, the one that exploded twice. Some are bubbly, some still. Few smell alarmingly like cheese. This one came in on Sister Annis's hair, a nun says fondly, holding up a jar named Windblown. She walked past a rosemary bush on a breezy day. Stuck. The starter you made is doing well, little pinpricks of fizz, a soft foam halo forming at the top. Sister Marone declares it gentle, slightly cheeky, and earmarks it for a citrus-sweet recipe next week. You feel oddly proud, like you've just been told your pet hamster got into college. Historians still argue whether convents intentionally bred specific yeast strains through generations, or if they simply accepted what nature gave. Some accounts describe the passing down of starter jars like heirlooms, protected and fed like pets. Others suggest these practices were more intuitive in art, not a science. Either way, Renaissance nuns knew what they were doing. Their beers were complex, repeatable, and by many accounts, superior to those of surrounding monasteries. Sister Heltrude pulls out a small black notebook. Want to name your strain? You blink. Seriously, of course. It's tradition. You think for a moment. How about ... whisper crumb? She writes it down with a smile. Welcome to the family, whisper crumb. Later that afternoon, you help make yeast cakes, a way of drying and preserving strains for later. The fresh yeast is mixed with flour and a pinch of salt, then shaped into little discs and left to dry on sun-warmed slate. These cakes can be stored for weeks, even months. Some are mailed to nearby convents. Others are saved for emergencies. A few, marked with an X, are added to the experimental box, where they will quietly ferment into legend or disaster. You ask what happens if a batch turns out badly? Oh, we bury it under the old fig tree, Sister Asina says. Unless it walks first. You decide not to ask follow-up questions. Evening falls again, and you're back in the courtyard, watching the last rays of sun light up a tray of finished yeast cakes. They smell faintly sour and warm, like if bread and rain had a baby. You run your finger across one. It's soft, still pliable. Tomorrow it will harden, and in a month, it might bring a new brew to life. You begin to see yeast differently now, not just as ingredient, but as lineage. A quiet continuity passed from one generation of nuns to the next. A living memory that bubbles, breathes, and occasionally burps at inconvenient moments. Before bed, you return to the kitchen, where someone's left you a gift. A tiny corked bottle labeled Whisper Crumb, Test 1. You open it cautiously. It fizzes just once like it's saying hi. You taste a drop. It's not bad. Not bad at all. You wake to the scent of rain, not thunder and drama, just that soft, mossy breath the world takes when it's rinsing itself clean. The convent's stone walls are slick with mist, and the gardens glisten like someone polished every leaf by hand. Your windows cracked open just enough to let in the cool, earthy air and the faint scent of wet hops. It's the kind of morning where everything moves half a step slower, which is perfect, because today's task isn't about speed, it's labeling day. Sister Hiltrude hands you a stack of parchment tags, a tin of ink, and a bundle of drying herbs. Today, she says with a yawn, we give the beer its real name. You blink. I thought we already named the batches. She smiles. Yes, but the bottles need labels, personalities, stories. You don't just hand someone a drink, you hand them a mood. So you sit at a long oak table, dipping your pen into inky swirls and carefully copying names onto parchment tags. Summer Cloister, I'd regret, St. Hildegard's Elbow. Each label includes the name, a bottling date, a cheeky recommended mood, and in small print, the ingredients. There's also a strange line on each one. Drink with intention. Mainstream fact. Labeling and branding of beer didn't really take off until much later in brewing history. But convents often recorded the details of each batch meticulously. These weren't commercial labels. They were more like intimate diaries of taste. Some even included sketches, prayers, or tiny poems. As you write. Sister Magdala explains that every label is written by hand Yvonne now. The bottle knows, she says. It remembers when someone cared enough to call it by name. There's something charmingly absurd about how serious they are with this. You spend 10 minutes debating whether Wistful Apricot is more accurate than Peach Lament. Eventually, you land on Bittersweet Orchard. Sister Agnetha sighs in relief. That's the one. It sounds like it tastes. You move on to decoration? Do you? No plastic labels or adhesive stickers here. Each parchment tag is tied to the bottleneck with dyed string red for strong ales, blue for mild ones, gold for seasonal specials. Some have pressed flowers glued on. Others are dusted with cinnamon. One is sealed with a wax thumbprint from Sister Benedicta herself. She says it's a blessing, or a threat, hard to say with her. Your fringe tidbit. In a 1492 convent near Lübeck, it's believed nuns created a coded label system using botanical symbols to represent beer strength and mood. A clover meant it was calming. A pepper leaf meant it was, let's say, ambitious. And a thistle? Drink with supervision. Historians found a few of these labels tucked in a hymn book, oddly enough right between 2 pages of Gregorian chant. You're starting to understand just how much love and mischief went into these bottles. They weren't made for mass consumption. They were made to last through winter, to comfort, to celebrate, to soothe a bad week, to toast a good harvest. Every bottle had a purpose, even if it was just to make Sister Ursina giggle after Vespers. You're handed a finished bottle to inspect. It's dark brown, weighty in your hand, the string tied just so. The tag reads, Black Fig Resurrection, for storms, grief, or Tuesdays. Ingredients, barley, fig, elderflower, wild yeast. Drink with intention. You drink it based on the poetry alone. But here's the kicker. Labeling isn't just about aesthetics. It's also about memory. Sister Marin opens a battered book from the 1470s, lined with fragile vellum pages, smudged ink, and the spidery handwriting of a nun named Apollonia. In it, she kept a log of every bottle she labeled. Not just the beer details, but where she was sitting, what the weather was like, what hymn she was humming. It's less inventory and more. Memoir. You read one aloud. Today I named the rosemary mint Mild Green Silence. The rain started as I finished the last tag. Sister Lena cried for no reason. We let her nap in the garden. I hope this batch soothes someone's soul. Historians still argue whether these label logs served a practical purpose or were simply emotional journaling. But reading them now, you feel like you're listening to voices long gone, spring through time, not about politics or war, but about herbs and feelings and the tiniest shades of taste. It's oddly moving, like beer-shaped time capsules. Later in the day, you help load the labeled bottles into the storage cellar, a cool, quiet place with stone walls and cedar shelves. You arrange them by batch date, type, and mood. You realize there's an entire shelf labeled existential, another labeled rainy day. The apocalypse shelf only has 2 bottles on it, one covered in beeswax, the other wrapped in velvet. What happens when someone opens an apocalypse bottle, you ask? Nothing, Sister Hiltrude says. That's the terrifying part. By late afternoon, your hands are ink-stained and smelling faintly of clove. You've labeled 27 bottles. One of them, you're told, will be gifted to you when you leave. It's called Quiet Triumph. You already love it. As evening falls, the final bottle is corked and tied. It's a spiced ale with notes of pear and rosemary. You name it herbal farewell. Sister Marin nods. Perfect. Tastes like a goodbye you're almost ready for. You exhale. And maybe, just maybe, you are. You're not quite sure when it started, but sometime during your stay. The convent became quieter, not in sound, but in feeling, like slipping into a warm bath or a thick blanket. The days still begin early. The chores still involve plenty of lifting, stirring, and sorting. But there's a rhythm now. You breathe in time with it. You start to hum along. Today, you re-invited to join one of the most serious rituals in the entire brewing process, the tasting panel. Yes, a literal table of nuns, gathered in a candlelit room, sipping small clay cups like judges at a medieval county fair. The only thing missing is a sash that reads Miss Best Hefwiesen. You're nervous, they notice. Sister Benedicta pats your shoulder. Don't worry, even if it's terrible, we'll just lie. The session begins with silence. Each panelist is handed a small cup. No label, no explanation. You follow their lead lift, inhale, sip. The first beer is light and tart with a hint of fennel. You murmur crisp, like walking barefoot on lemongrass. Everyone nods. Mainstream fact: Renaissance nuns took tasting very seriously. It's not only because they brewed for their own sustenance, but because their beer was also used as medicine, trade, and even charity. A bad batch wasn't just disappointing. It could ruin a barter, fail to nourish, or cause actual illness. The second beer is darker. It's malty with notes of something smoky. You squint. Burnt almond. Sister Hiltrude raises an eyebrow. Interesting. I got regret in a thunderstorm. You smile. That feels accurate too. And here's the surprise. Everyone's description is different. Not just flavors, but stories. Sister Agnes says one beer tastes like the third song in a minor key psalm. Another says a sharp stout reminds her of that time the geese escaped. There is absolutely no technical language used, just poetry, emotion, and memory. Fringe tidbit. One convent in Umbria kept a taste wheel made entirely of emotion. Words bitterness was labeled jealousy. Sweetness became mercy, and sour notes were marked repentance. The wheel was color-coded and carved onto a round wooden board, with arrows pointing to mood-pairing meals. It still exists, sort of. It's currently in a museum basement, miscategorized as monastic game piece. Your tongue is tingling, and your notes are filled with phrases like whispers of stone fruit and hints of betrayal. The final tasting is yours, Whispercrumb. You recognize it instantly. There's something humble and golden about it. Slightly effervescent, with a strange, comforting roundness that makes it feel familiar. Everyone sips, everyone pauses. Sister Marin says this tastes like a secret someone's forgiven you for. You'd blink. You hadn't thought of it that way, but she's right. They rate it. A solid, meditative beer. Good for long walks and sad letters. You are, in their words, officially undisgraced. Historians still argue whether these tasting rituals were based in structured knowledge or pure mysticism. Were the nuns secretly training their palates through experience? Or did they simply trust their intuition, layering flavor with mood like Renaissance sommeliers? Either way, it worked. Their beers were praised far and wide. Some even made it into royal courts, though the bottles were often relabeled and passed off as monk-made. Classic. After the tasting, you join Sister Ursula in the infirmary. She's preparing the next round of remedial ales, beers brewed with specific herbs for their supposed healing properties. Today's recipe includes chamomile, sage, and mugwort. It's for sleep, she explains, so makes your dreams very interesting. One time, I fought a giant duck. These therapeutic beers are brewed in smaller batches, often with less alcohol and more botanical infusion. They're not meant for joy or feasting, but for healing. Sister Ursula has bottles marked melancholy, digestive grace, and stiff joints. One is labeled Very Bad Tuesday. She won't elaborate. You help her prepare the ingredients, slicing fresh ginger and drying lavender. Each herb is added slowly, by hand, with a whispered intention. Feel better, she murmurs to one. Ease the worry, to another. It sounds silly until you realize this is prayer in liquid form. Sister Ursula tells you they send bottles out once a month, left discreetly on doorsteps, wrapped in linen. No charge, she says. Just drink it warm and sit near something green. You ask if people write back. Sometimes, she says. Sometimes they just send flowers. The idea of beer as medicine isn't new. Ancient civilizations used fermented drinks to deliver herbal remedies. But here, in this quiet convent, it feels more intimate. Like the nuns aren't curing bodies, they're curing moods. Brewing for feelings no one has words for. You carry a crate of these emotional ales to the loading alcove, your arms heavy with kindness. Later that evening, just before Compline, you find a slip of paper tucked into your satchel. It's your whisper crumb tasting sheet. Someone has drawn a small smiley face next to the word bittersweet. On the back, there's a handwritten note. Your yeast made something worth sipping slowly. Try to do that with your life too. You sit on the stone bench outside the chapel, paper in hand, bottle in lap, watching the sky dim into lavender. The bottle cap pops quietly. The taste is soft and thoughtful. You take another sip and smile, because this is the good kind of sad. You wake before the bell, not from noise, from stillness. It's that deep, amber-colored kind of quiet that only exists when nothing is rushing to meet you. It smells faintly of baked oats and damp linen. Single candle flickers on the stone ledge by your cot. Someone must have lit it for you. Today's your last full day in the convent. You stretch slowly, joints creaking like pew wood. Right outside, the morning is already brushing the herb garden in soft gold. A breeze carries the scent of rosemary and warm stone. The bells haven't rung yet. Time is holding its breath. Sister Hiltrude greets you at the refectory with a loaf of bread that somehow smells like apple cider and sass. Breakfast beer, she says, handing you a stubby bottle with a peach-colored tag. It reads, Sunrise Dignity, best before small talk. You sit with the sisters and chew in comfortable silence. Nobody makes a big deal about you leaving. They just pass you extra jam. And one nun gives you a wink so exaggerated it feels like a farewell poem. You spend the morning walking the brewery one last time. You trace the copper kettles with your fingertips, like saying goodbye to old friends. The mash tun still smells faintly of lemon balm and heat. You peek inside the fermentation barrels, watching the gentle bubbling like the world's most polite jacuzzi. It all feels slower today, more tender. Mainstream fact, by the late 15th century, many convent breweries had become so proficient they supplied entire towns with beer, though often anonymously or through nearby abbeys. Records show that female-run brewing operations rivaled their male counterparts in volume and consistency, especially in regions like Bavaria and Flanders. In the storeroom, you help Sister Ursula pack the last few bottles into crates. You're careful with each one, wrapping them in linen, tucking them between herbs for cushioning. She hands you a small tag to keep. Taste what matters. At midday, you've re-pulled into a final blessing that is honestly just a very long toast. Sister Benedicta clinks her clay cup and announces, to the visitor who didn't accidentally poison us. Truly a low bar. But still, we're grateful. You all raise your cups. The beer is light, citrusy, with a mischievous aftertaste. You suspect lemon verbena, maybe a whisper of mint. Someone burps discreetly. Someone else bows their head and says, Amen. You spend your last afternoon with Sister Marin in the scriptorium, where she's copying an old brewing guide. She lets you help with the illustrations, tiny doodles of herbs, barrels, and a very cheerful-looking yeast cell. Give it eyes, she says. Everything's friendlier with eyes. She pulls out one last recipe. Not ancient, not historic, just one she wrote last week. Spiced grief ale. For farewells and beginnings. Notes, cinnamon, pear, barley, 2 tears. She smiles. I want you to take this one with you. Brew it when you're missing something or someone. Fringe tidbit. A 15th century French convent was rumored to send farewell bottles with departing novices' age, one unique to the Sister-S temperament. Historians discovered bottles labeled things like Quiet Storm, Half Done Goodbye, and Come Back If You Want. One surviving bottle, found beneath a chapel floorboard, still had a half-legible note inside. Keep sipping and don't forget how silly you were. As sunset colors the courtyard in dusky rose and bronze, you share one final walk with the sisters. They point out the herbs that are just starting to bloom. A young novice shows you the tiniest hops cone, barely the size of a pinky nail. She's glowing. My first one, she whispers. It's probably terrible. You grin. That's how you know it's yours. You're handed a small satchel for the journey. Bread, a corked bottle of Quiet Triumph, and a folded note sealed in wax. You don't open it, not yet. At the edge of the convent gates, you turn back. No fanfare, no waving. Just Sister Hiltrude, holding a broom and a mug, leaning against the wall like it's the only thing keeping her upright. She raises the mug. Drink with intention, she says. Then she disappears inside. You take your first steps onto the road, the stones warm underfoot, the trees rustling like they're whispering secrets. In your bag, the bottle clinks gently against the bread loaf. You walk slowly, you have no reason to rush. And now you let your breath soften. The road you've walked stone by stone, step by patient, step fades gently behind you, like mist curling away from the morning sun. That old stone convent, with its haphazard herb beds and crooked chimneys, feels distant now, not gone, just tucked safely in memory, like a bottle labeled for when you need comfort. Let the weight of the day settle into your limbs. Not heavy, just enough to remind you of the work you've done, the warmth you've earned, the stillness that's waiting. You remember the scent of fermenting hops earth, warm, like sourdough in dusk. You remember the soft clink of bottles and crates, the ink-smudged tags, the quiet blessing whispered into every batch. You remember laughter between long silences, and how peace didn't arrive with fanfare but drifted in, like candle smoke. Your breathing slows, each inhale a little deeper, each exhale a little longer. You don't need to hold the story tightly. It's already part of you, like yeast in warm water, like joy steeped in herbs. It'll carry its taste forward. Somewhere in you, a label has been written, for gentle nights and soft goodbyes. So now, you just rest. Let your thoughts loosen, dissolve like sugar in warm tea. You're safe. You're still. The journey's behind you, but the warmth lingers. Sleep is close, like a corked bottle, sealed tight, keeping everything precious inside. Let go, you've earned it. Good night.